In Lebanon, what are her goals on this mission?
Well, as she herself has said, basically to leave no stone unturned to ensure that the hostages are released. There are at least 8 Germans amongst the 203 hostages being held by Hamas. And she said that she is in nonstop communication with her counterparts throughout the region, and that means in a number of Arab countries as well, to try to ensure that the hostages are being treated with humanity and also that they will be released. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is to prevent what she referred to in her stop yesterday in Jordan as a regional conflagration. And there, too, seeking contact with leaders across the region who perhaps also could prevail upon Hezbollah, the Islamic militia based in Lebanon. And she plans to go to Lebanon after Israel today to prevail upon them and their patron, Iran, not to get into the fray. And it's quite interesting to note that although Joe Biden's talks with the Egyptian and Jordanian leaders were canceled, the German leadership, also Chancellor Scholz, have very close contact with Egypt, with Jordan, with Qatar, with many countries that could exercise perhaps some influence in stopping this conflict from widening. And Germany historically has seen that kind of a mediation role as part of its special duty to Israel and has, in fact, participated in mediating prisoner swaps. And the foreign minister has just announced that she will go on now to Cairo on Saturday to a special peace summit that has been called at very short notice by Egypt. So trying hard to use those channels to stop a regional conflagration. And then, thirdly, as she has said, to show those in Gaza, the civilians, that we know of their suffering and want to help. She's appointed a special emissary for humanitarian aid. Germany has announced it will commit $50 million. So all of that driving her to nonstop shuttle diplomacy.
We should mention that Annalena Baerbock was just in the region last week, right? She visited Israel then as well. She's back in Tel Aviv right now. We saw Chancellor Scholz also visiting the region. He was in both Israel and he spoke with Jordan's leader. He was in Egypt as well. Why is Annalena Baerbock going back again so soon?
Well, as I said, because she has said we absolutely must do everything in our power. And with that, she means everything to support Israel. Germany has said always that Israel's existence is part of Germany's state rationale, as it were, Staatsräson in Germany, meaning a highest priority for the country of Germany. And therefore, there's no question that Germany's solidarity is with Israel. And at the same time, she is trying very hard, as is the Chancellor, to also show compassion for the civilians in Gaza who are bearing a terrible brunt of the suffering there. And as she yesterday said, to try to tell the stories of those suffering on both sides. So she's made it a point to include in her speeches in Jordan descriptions of those she's met in Israel who have lost loved ones or perhaps have members of the family who've been taken hostage, while in some of the Arab countries in the region, she talks about the Israelis that she's met. So it's a real endeavor, I think, on her part to cultivate a humanity that she hopes could perhaps stem some of this suffering.
So the foreign minister is showing understanding, empathy, expressing empathy there. It's a symbolic act to go there again so quickly and to visit all of these places and talk to them, as you suggested. But what about Germany actually playing a role as a possible mediator? You mentioned this. Do you see a potential for that in this situation?
I don't think anybody here thinks that Germany and anybody in Berlin in the government will be thinking that Germany can somehow stop this conflagration of itself all alone. But there is no question that the combined efforts that we're seeing, President Macron also traveling to a number of different Arab countries, Rishi Sunak going to Saudi Arabia as well as Israel, and the German leaders, all of them trying very, very hard hard to open up every form of diplomatic communication available because, indeed, there is a danger of a two-front war if Hezbollah does, in fact, increase its attacks in the north. It's very unclear what role Lebanon and Hezbollah could play. And, of course, it all depends very much on Iran. And all of this is about trying to establish that coalition of Arab countries that could possibly exercise some influence with Hezbollah, which essentially is Iran's sword. It's means of proxy acting to inflame this conflict and turn it into a vast regional war with international implications.
Melinda, stay with us. We're just waiting for Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, to begin her press conference in Tel Aviv. While we're waiting for that, let's take a look at while we're waiting for that, let's take a look at German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. He's been in Israel and Egypt, as I mentioned, too, in a push to de-escalate tensions. In a speech to Parliament here in Berlin after returning from that visit, the Chancellor said Germany's place is firmly by Israel's side.
Family members of hostages abducted by Hamas during its terror attack on Israel. Guests in the German parliament listening to Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who has just returned from the Middle East. Scholz reaffirms his government's support for Israel and for efforts to get the hostages free. More than 200 are being held in Gaza, among them a number of German nationals.
An important task for us is freeing the hostages. They must be released without any conditions. I want to say this very clearly to those who preach terror. Many of those who were kidnapped were activists at the forefront of seeking peace in the region. I learned this from their friends and families. This needs to be said here too. We are working for the release of the hostages.
Scholz also spoke about the situation of civilians in the Gaza Strip.
They are equally victims and hostages of Hamas. It's using them as human shields, which is inhumane. You can't describe it any other way. It seized control over them in a coup. They're helpless in the face of the power and terror of Hamas. That is why it is very, very important to find ways of providing humanitarian aid.
Scholz said that there is now a good chance that aid will finally make it into Gaza soon. But an end to the wider crisis is still nowhere in sight.
Well, while we're waiting for German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock to begin her news conference in Tel Aviv, with me in the studio is DW's Melinda Crane, our chief political analyst. Melinda, this is an important time, not just for the leaders in the Middle East who are dealing with this conflict, but also for mediators, for countries that are aligned with Israel as well. Germany is among those. This is an important time for German leadership.
Absolutely, it is. And it's also a challenge for German leadership. As I mentioned earlier, Israel's existence is absolutely a core priority for Germany. Germany's solidarity with Israel is based on the historic tragedy, of course, of this country having perpetrated the Holocaust and therefore having a very special relationship with Israel. And that's been apparent in some of the very strong speeches that we have heard from the German leadership, including the foreign minister. We're about to hear her speaking once again in Israel, who has really declared with passionate intensity this country's support for Israel. And at the same time, enormous concern here in Germany, which also is home to many Arab and Muslim migrants, about the situation in Gaza, about the suffering of civilians there, and concern about trying to prevail upon Israel to show some form of restraint, not a word that German leaders are necessarily using in that clarity. But again and again, we're hearing increasing references now from the Chancellor, from the Foreign Minister, for Israel to carry out any operations that it is conducting in Gaza with respect for international law. And international law does require proportionality in directing attacks against perpetrators, military targets, terrorists, but not against civilians, in attempting to protect civilians in the course of military operations. And German leaders are being careful to mention that obligation, but it's a fine, fine line. There are a lot of eggshells upon which to tread in this situation, and particularly challenging, I think, for this country with its special relationship to Israel.
Yeah, it must be said that both Chancellor Scholz and Foreign Minister Baerbock have stressed the need to respect the rights of civilians in Gaza, and they've drawn attention to the humanitarian suffering that we're witnessing in Gaza since the blockade, essentially, by Israel. So there's no aid getting into Gaza, which is very, very dependent on that aid. Annalena Baerbock is very conscious of that. She announced 50 million euros in aid for humanitarian aid for the people of living in the Gaza Strip. But we have to ask ourselves, given the current situation, is that money able to do any good?
Yeah, you know, also President Biden thought that he had accomplished essentially the establishment now of corridors for that aid to go in, and yet we're hearing the Rafah crossing is still closed. Those trucks are still trying to wait. There are many questions apparently about who inspects the shipments going in, because Israel has said it should not include even such basic goods as fuel, which, by the way, would be badly needed to keep hospitals in Gaza running.
And the water purification plants, apparently that's a critical part, too. We heard the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres stressing the need to get the sanitation system going again, the water purification system, because there is no clean drinking water in Gaza. We heard that also confirmed in an interview I conducted with a journalist in the Gaza Strip today. The people there are living in dire conditions.
Indeed, it's one of the stories that Annalena Baerbock mentioned yesterday when she was in Jordan, saying that when she hears that a mother is feeding or giving her children brackish water, in other words, salty, polluted water, that it just breaks her heart. And indeed, that is the plight that many, many people here are abundantly aware of. So that 50 million in humanitarian help, how can it reach those who need it so badly? Undoubtedly, this will be a key topic tomorrow at this peace summit that has been called by Egypt, and certainly amongst the topics that the German leadership have been speaking about with Mr. Assisi, with the Egyptian leadership, is the question of how do we get that crossing open? But it is a two-way process, and there are obstacles on both sides.
And I just want to remind our viewers that if you're just joining us here on DW News, we're waiting for German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock to begin a news conference in Tel Aviv. The Foreign Minister has traveled there for the second time in 2 weeks, showing her solidarity with Israel, stressing Israel's right to defend itself, while also drawing attention to the need to provide relief to the Palestinians the Palestinian civilians who are trapped in the Gaza Strip under a blockade, with Israel continuing to launch airstrikes against Hamas terrorist targets there. So, as we're waiting for this conference, our chief political analyst, Melinda Crane, is in the studio with us. Melinda, I wanted to ask you about, again, the foreign minister's trip. She's visiting 3 countries. She's in Israel right now, but there's also Jordan and Lebanon, crucially Lebanon, where there could be another front opening up for Israel in this war. The militia, the Hezbollah, that are based in Lebanon with Iran support, they are considered to be pretty well armed, and Israel is bracing for a possible attack on its northern border. There's a great deal of concern also in the German political establishment that this war could spread. Everyone is very tense about what is going to happen next. We're waiting for a ground offensive, a ground operation that Israel is expected to carry out in the Gaza Strip. They haven't begun that yet, but they've been massing troops on the border with their powerful, powerful army. We're expecting that to be a very bloody battle indeed.
Indeed, and I think it's fascinating that the foreign minister does want to go to Lebanon at this time. Right before I came into the studio, I checked to see whether that trip is still on, because in fact, the German Foreign Service is warning Germans to leave Lebanon at this point. So she's clearly still intending to go in the opposite direction. The Hezbollah have been sending rockets already across the border, but so far, limited military targeting, Israel responding in kind. So no evidence yet of the kind of wider attack that certainly many people fear could occur. That would open up a second front for Israel, very problematic at the time when it does plan to try to attack or revenge the attack by Hamas. And at the same time, concern that should Hezbollah then move toward a real all-out attack in the north of Israel, that Iran gets pulled in as well, because, of course, Hezbollah is a proxy for Iran. So that is part of the frantic diplomacy that we are seeing, the attempt to prevail upon Hezbollah. Interestingly enough, Hezbollah's leader, Nasrallah, has not spoken in the entire 16 days since the attack occurred. This is interesting if you compare it to the situation in 2006, where essentially he gave an incendiary speech, and that was the beginning of a very, very terrible violence that Hezbollah perpetrated. So clearly, at the moment, Hezbollah is considering its options, but we've seen the Iranian foreign minister, for example, traveling to Lebanon to issue essentially a very clear warning that Iran and Hezbollah are prepared to act. And of course, we've also seen tweets by the leadership in Tehran saying time is up, whatever that's supposed to mean. So
rather cryptic.
An extremely, extremely flammable situation here that could indeed turn into a massive conflict with international implications if we consider the fact that there are 2 U.S. aircraft carriers now also in the region. Very, very, very concerning, and therefore perhaps no wonder that we're seeing this kind of, sleepless 24/7 diplomacy by the foreign minister and by so many other international leaders.
Exactly. Looking at Iran and trying to understand the calculus of Hamas in launching this horrific attack on Israel on October 7th, which left at least 1,400 Israelis dead, including a number of foreign nationals, it must be said. All those hostages, more than 200 hostages apparently are being held in Hamas-controlled territory in the Gaza Strip, probably in tunnels deep underground, and what their fate will be is also hanging in the balance as well. But one has to ask oneself, what is the calculus that Hamas had in launching this attack? What is it that they were hoping to unleash with that? Because it's certainly not going to help the Palestinian cause in the short or the medium term. And one has to wonder if the intention was to provoke Israel, indeed, into such a response that it would unleash something much wider. This is in the back of everyone's minds. It's a deep concern. It's motivating the shuttle diplomacy that we're seeing, this flurry of diplomacy into not just into Israel, but into all neighboring countries as well. Could that have been the calculus? And how concerned should we be that Iran will indeed respond once Israel begins its ground offensive in the Gaza Strip?
Well, 3 things. One of the first things that people looked at after the Hamas attack was the degree of explicit involvement by Iran in this attack. So far, we have seen no clear evidence that Iran in some way, indirectly or directly, ordered the attack, that it was complicit in this particular incident. There is no doubt at all whatsoever about its overall complicity. It has been supplying Hamas and Hezbollah, of course, with weapons. It is essentially...
Islamic Jihad, we should also mention. I mean, there are other terrorist groups inside Gaza.
Precisely. Precisely. So there is no doubt about Iran's general complicity. Nonetheless, we have not yet seen specific evidence that it in any way ordered this attack or that it told Hamas now is the time. But there is thinking that for Hamas, the timing had everything to do with the fact that Israel and Saudi Arabia were just about to sign another in the agreement, a set of agreements known as the Abraham Accords. Those have been the agreements by which a variety of Arab countries have recognized Israel's existence and thereby established diplomatic relations with Israel for the first time. That's UAE, Bahrain, Qatar. And Saudi Arabia, the biggest prize in the region, was about to do the same. Now, that clearly is not in Iran's interest. And many feel that Hamas may have been looking to try to stop that and then to provoke the kind of Palestinian suffering that indeed would discredit Israel so greatly that they would no longer be a partner for Saudi Arabia going forward.
I've been reading also that Hamas apparently felt that it had been completely overlooked in any talks in these Abraham Accords that you're talking about, and that relations between Saudi Arabia and Hamas are not exactly what Hamas would perhaps like them to be. Anyway, stay with us, Melinda. We're still waiting for that press conference to get underway in Tel Aviv with the German Foreign Minister. But first, we're going to look at some other news. Trying to get queued up here. Palestinian militants. We've been talking about them. They continue to fire rockets into Gaza, into Israel from Gaza on Thursday. Now, this happened as Israeli forces struck targets in the Gaza Strip throughout the day, including in the south of the territory, where Israel had told Gazans to head for their own safety. One explosion there reportedly killed and injured several people, including children.
A father carrying his child to the grave. His was one of 3 children among those receiving their final rites on this barren patch of land. Prayers are held to the sound of Israeli aircraft hovering above. A constant menace to the Palestinians below, and a reminder of the airstrike on the town of Khan Yunis that killed the civilians being buried here. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have fled the northern part of the Gaza Strip after Israel told them to leave for the south. Running out of food and desperate for shelter, they have found no reprieve from Israel's relentless bombing campaign.
We came from Gaza City. They told us to come to the south, so we came to the south. We found that the strikes intensified in the south. We stayed in a house. In front of us, there were strikes. Behind us, strikes. There's no safety. There's nowhere safe in Gaza. You have to be ready to die and to just stay in your house.
Israel vows to continue targeting Hamas all over Gaza.
When there is a threat originating or being conducted against Israel from the south, then we will strike, absolutely.
And it will soon move its powerful army into the Strip, Israel's defense minister told troops massing on its border.
I promise you that whoever sees Gaza now from afar will see it from the inside. Good luck.
An Israeli ground operation will likely focus on the north, at least in the initial stages. With Hamas expected to put up fierce resistance, the battered confines of southern Gaza may still prove a sanctuary of sorts.
Now, Hazem Balusha is a journalist who is now in Gaza. Earlier, I asked him about the humanitarian situation there.
The humanitarian situation is getting hard and harsh. No electricity, no power at all, no drinking water, no internet, limited access to food, no borders, no trucks coming in. People are lining on bakeries, in grocery shops and restaurants. People can afford some stuff, but still others are not. Some people are staying at UNRWA schools, and they are providing very limited amount of food and according to the limited amount that they have, according to their officials. All the services and infrastructure are down in Gaza. Barely we are connected on the phone. It comes and goes. No internet. People are not communicating as regular. People don't know here, and the officials, like how long that Gaza can survive with the current situation.
There are efforts to resume aid deliveries to Gaza across the border with Egypt. Are Palestinians in Gaza expecting those aid deliveries to resume, to actually reach them?
Well, this is a question that how and when this aid will come. There are a lot of reports that it would come today, but seems like up to now nothing came into Gaza. They are talking about 20 trucks, which is very limited, and this would be through the UN agencies, particularly UNRWA, and maybe Red Crescent. We don't know yet about the mechanism. And I don't know how this would be distributed to ordinary people, the other people in the south, or only for those refugees are staying at the UNRWA schools.
Is there any place in Gaza where the people there can flee to and be safe?
Actually not. I'm displaced myself with my family for the third time in this war. Many people left their places in north and Gaza City to the south. But, you know, overnight here, I'm in the central Gaza Strip, and I still hear bombardments and airstrikes. There were many reports about airstrikes in Rafah and Khan Yunis, which is in the south. Many buildings were destroyed. There are many people killed in different airstrikes. But we have to say that it's more intense in Gaza and north. Here is continued, but still there are many people killed by or due to the airstrikes.
Hazem, thank you very much for your reporting. That was journalist Hazem Balusha speaking to us from Gaza.
Thank you.
Well, earlier I spoke with our correspondent Tanya Kramer in Jerusalem. I asked her why Israel has not yet launched its expected ground operation in Gaza.
Well, I think there are certainly strategic considerations by the Israeli army. They want still, although it is expected, have an element of surprise. We heard now the defense minister saying, and some officials, army officials saying that, saying to the troops here, you will see Gaza from the inside soon. Now, this could be an indication that this will actually happen soon, the ground invasion, but we don't know for sure when they will go in. But there might be also other considerations here. We're hearing a lot from the Israeli military correspondents here that there is a concern in the north with the border, Israel's border with Lebanon, that Hezbollah, the Shiite Lebanese group, militant group Hezbollah, could enter the war. Because they have said if a ground invasion will happen, they might do so, and there's a lot of concern. So it could also be related to that preparations are ongoing. And we're hearing this morning there has been another evacuation order of a bigger town in the north, Kiryat Shmoni, that the people there should actually evacuate to places further south in Israel.
There's also a lot of concern about the hostages being held by Hamas. Tanya, is there any word on their fate?
No, we don't know much about their location, what is happening to them, but there has been a video that has been released by the Hamas militant wing last week, showing one of the hostages there in a different environment. There, she was talking to her family. So this is one of the videos that has been released. The Israeli government said you might expect more of this, but many people still don't know. I mean, 203 people are confirmed to have been taken hostages now by the military, here the Israeli military, but some people still don't know what happened to their families, because some are still the identification process of those who were killed in the initial attacks 2 weeks ago is still ongoing.
Tanya, thank you. DW's Tanya Kramer there in Jerusalem. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres is on his way to the Rafah border crossing between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. That's where a limited number of trucks are expected to deliver humanitarian aid into Gaza in the coming hours, it's hoped, following a plan announced by the U.S. President Joe Biden. Well, Gaza is currently experiencing severe shortages of fuel, food, and medicines. Israel launched airstrikes, of course, in Gaza and sealed the territory off from supplies after Hamas militants entered Israel almost 2 weeks ago and killed at least 1,400 people. The UN chief says more than 2 million people in Gaza are at risk of dehydration and waterborne diseases.
Civilians in Gaza desperately need core services and supplies, and for that we need rapid, unimpeded humanitarian access. We need food, water, medicine, and fuel now. We need it at scale, and we need it to be sustained.
Earlier, I spoke with Karim El-Gawari, a journalist who is in Egypt's capital, Cairo. I asked him what Egyptian authorities are saying about when aid deliveries to Gaza might resume.
Well, the talk is that it is set for today, that also in the presence of the UN General Secretary Guterres. Officially, it's not open yet because there is extensive repair work, especially on the Palestinian side, because this area, since the war broke out, was bombed 4 times in its vicinity, and the street to the border crossing has extensive damage. But I hear that until now, there's also, until this moment, a struggle in the background between the US, Israel, and Egypt about how much aid will be allowed in. Until now, it's supposed to be only 20 trucks that can go to specific locations once the border is open. But of course, on the Egyptian side, there are many, many more trucks lined up. Talk is about that there's waiting aid of 3,000 tons right now on the other side. Talk for sure will be also about the foreign nationals and possibilities for them to leave the Gaza Strip via this Rafah border crossing. Egypt, since days, tries to link the two things. They're saying like they can go out only if aid comes in, and that is all still probably under discussion until now. It's not sure if and when this crossing is really opening today.
You know, we're talking about humanitarian aid for people who are living under extremely difficult conditions and civilians who are facing serious health issues, among other things. They're hungry. Why has it been so difficult, Karim, to get that aid flowing back into Gaza?
Well, it has to be done in coordination between Egypt, Hamas, Israel, and the UN. It seems to be very, very difficult. From the Egyptian side, they are ready to bring the aid in. The big topic for the Egyptian side is about crossing the border, opening the border crossing, and for the Palestinians to leave from there. There's a big fear in Egypt about a Palestinian exodus from Gaza. Egyptian President Sisi just said that the current war was not just aimed at fighting Hamas, but also an attempt to push civilian inhabitants to migrate to Egypt. That's is the big fear. You have to understand there is a Palestinian and Arab trauma about a Nakba, the fear that Palestinians once again will be forcefully displaced. Until now, in their history, whenever they escaped to another country, they were never allowed back. And I think that is really the big issue. This is also the issue in Jordan. This is the issue in Egypt right now, why they are so reluctant that Palestinians can come from the Gaza Strip.
Karim, thank you very much for now. That was journalist Karim El-Gawari reporting from Egypt's capital, Cairo. You are watching DW News. We're just waiting for a news conference to begin in Tel Aviv with the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock. We're looking at live pictures now from the venue where that news conference is expected to take place. We know that Annalena Baerbock is there, and the press conference was supposed to be getting underway a short while ago. We are waiting on it. We do plan to bring that to you live when the German Foreign Minister speaks. It's her second trip to the region in 2 weeks. There's been a flurry of diplomacy trying to stop this war between Hamas and Israel from spreading into a broader regional conflict. Cybersecurity experts are warning that international hackers are increasingly targeting Israeli websites and infrastructure. In one case, the Jerusalem Post news site says it was forced offline several times in recent days. Groups based in Gaza, Iran, and Russia are among those under suspicion.
In cyber war, there are no clear front lines. Even for experts, it's difficult to determine which groups are behind recent cyber attacks on Israeli websites.
I think it's very important to be cautious of anything that you see. Misinformation and disinformation are going to be very prevalent throughout all of this. Groups may claim things that weren't necessarily attributed by them done by them.
There have been reports about misinformation being spread via an Israeli rocket warning app. The hacker group Anon Ghost claims to have managed to insert fake notifications on the app, with phrases such as "death to Israel" and "the nuclear bomb is coming." The aim of these kinds of attacks appears to be creating panic and confusion, but there are also attempts to cut off civilians from potentially crucial information. More than 100 Israeli websites have been downed by distributed denial of service or DDoS attacks. Hackers flood websites with requests until their servers collapse. One prominent example, the Jerusalem Post, one of Israel's most read newspapers, was downed for more than 24 hours. The hacker collective Anonymous Sudan claims to be responsible for this attack. They describe themselves as an anti-Western, pro-Islam hacker collective, but this claim is doubted by experts. It's also doubtful if they are cooperating with Hamas.
I think we do need to be careful of saying directly that they have coordinated with Hamas. We don't know that. We don't have that insight yet. However, these cyber attacks are working to their advantage to have the psychological aspect of taking down the systems of Israel, perhaps meddling with the alerting systems and allowing rockets to get through.
Another hacker collective, pro-Russian Killnet, has even threatened to target all Israeli government systems with distributed denial of service attacks. A more concerning hacking strategy is trying to get access to IT systems of critical infrastructure. A Microsoft report said that in early 2023, hackers used fake LinkedIn profiles to pose as software developers. They tried to manipulate employees into installing malware. It's not clear if these attacks were successful. Experts fear that hackers could potentially use installed backdoors to destroy critical infrastructure.
In the instances of malware, what we've seen a lot in the Ukraine is wipers being used to wipe systems, wherein they will target a power station, perhaps, and install wipers to shut down the systems there. And I've seen recently coming out from Ukraine that actually has more impact than a bombing, because that can shut down a whole area rather than a bombing on the system, which would just shut down that one power station.
In case hackers get access to critical infrastructure via malware, the consequences can be devastating. With hackers adding more complexity to an already extreme situation, citizens are likely to be the main victims.
We're just waiting for a press conference to get underway. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock is in Tel Aviv holding talks with the Israeli leadership. She's due to speak soon. We're looking now at live pictures from the venue where that news conference is expected to take place. We're going to be bringing you that address live. Meanwhile, Israel says more than 200 people were taken hostage by Hamas during the terror attacks earlier this month. They include the elderly, the disabled, and children. The hostages captured in southern Israel and taken to Gaza are likely to be used as a bargaining tool. Their distraught families are urging the Israeli government to prioritize their safe return.
On a wall outside the Israeli Defense Ministry in Tel Aviv, and on walls across Israel, the images of those taken and missing.
The Israeli government must focus, first of all, on doing whatever is necessary in order to release the hijacked people.
In the October 7th attack, Hamas terrorists killed indiscriminately, and they kidnapped civilians, soldiers, the elderly, disabled, and children. So many children. Now the hostages are somewhere in the Gaza Strip, or under it, in the untold hundreds of kilometers of tunnels Hamas has built.
Now there'll be lots of effort put into coordinating, identifying and locating where the hostages are being kept as much as possible. And of course, in the background, there's talk of potentially hostage rescue attempts, but these are very, very dangerous options with not always a guaranteed chance of success.
What Hamas recognizes, Scott Walker says, is that Israel has consistently prioritized the safe return of their citizens. Case in point, the 19-year-old Israeli soldier held by Hamas for 5 years. Israel got him back by giving up more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners to Hamas.
They always want to take captives. They know what captives can do. One Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, and that's the price that Israel is willing to pay.
The hostages ruthlessly taken on October 7th, and likely guarded now by some of the Hamas kidnappers, face a lengthy captivity, and indeed the threat of death from the captors. The families of those hostages are shaken and afraid, desperate for any word, and hopeful that the images of their sisters, brothers, parents, grandparents remain in the forefront of Israel's moves against Hamas.
If you're just joining us here on DW News, we're waiting for a news conference to begin in Tel Aviv. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock is there, holding talks with the Israeli leadership. She's expected to begin speaking to the media soon. We're looking at live pictures from the venue as we wait for that news conference to get underway. We'll be bringing you full coverage of what she has to say. Meanwhile, of course, everyone is nervous about when Israel might launch its ground offensive in Gaza. When its forces do that, they will likely have to deal with a formidable network of tunnels under the territory. The network is reportedly used by militant Islamist Hamas and other jihadist organizations. Dozens or perhaps even hundreds of kilometers long. The tunnels are known as the Gaza Metro. Let's take a closer look.
One of many Israeli airstrikes on Gaza, this one targeting Gaza's tunnel network, according to the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF. Destroying the tunnels used by the militant Islamist group Hamas has long been a priority for Israel's military. The network runs underneath Gaza, connecting its cities, running to the border with Israel, and also connecting the Strip with Egypt. The tunnels let militants store weapons, launch attacks, and are believed to contain Hamas command centers. Gaza's tunnels are also lifelines to the outside world, passageways for importing essential goods as well as weapons under a long-standing Israeli blockade. This animated video released by Israel shows what they supposedly look like inside. Militant Islamist Hamas has been developing the tunnel network since they came to power in 2007. Recently, Hamas claimed the tunnel network is 500 kilometers long. Hamas and other jihadist groups use tunnel exits, basically holes in the ground, to launch rocket attacks on Israel. The launchers are then brought back underground. That makes them nearly impossible for Israel to see or target. Israel has tried bombarding the tunnels in 2014, in 2017, and 2021 to destroy the network, without success, but with significant civilian casualties. The tunnel network is reportedly woven underneath marketplaces, apartment blocks, and hospitals.
U.S. President Joe Biden has urged Americans to support tens of billions of dollars in funding for Israel and Ukraine, saying they were fighting for democracy. In a rare speech from the White House's Oval Office, he stressed that backing both was vital for U.S. national security. Biden said the world was looking to America for leadership and that the U.S. couldn't afford to abandon its allies.
American leadership is what holds the world together. American alliances are what keep us, America, safe. American values are what make us a partner that other nations want to work with. To put all that at risk, if we walk away from Ukraine, if we turn our backs on Israel, it's just not worth it. That's why tomorrow I'm going to send to Congress an urgent budget request to fund America's national security needs, to support our critical partners, including Israel and Ukraine. is a smart investment that's going to pay dividends for American security for generations. Help us keep American troops out of harm's way. Help us build a world that is safer, more peaceful, more prosperous for our children and grandchildren.
Earlier, I asked DW's William Glucroft to tell us more about Biden taking that unusual step of addressing the American people from the Oval Office.
It is unusual. I'm trying to remember a time when a U.S. president gave a major primetime national address about something going on.
And we're cutting straight back to Tel Aviv, where German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock is about to address the media. She is on a three-nation tour of the Middle East. She with stops in Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel. She's currently in Tel Aviv. This is her second visit to the region within 2 weeks. Annalena Baerbock, of course, serving as German Foreign Minister.
Guten Tag auch von meiner Seite.
Here we go.
I
talked to my counterpart, Eli Cohen, and Minister Benny Gantz today in Israel here, and I assured both of them that Germany stands firmly at the side of Israel. Israel not only has the right, but also the obligation to protect its population within the framework of the international law. And in each talk, also today, one notices that the terror of Hamas, the inhumane atrocities have hurt Israel severely, and they are very hard to digest. This inhumanity remains being a break in history. The plight of the families are devastating, and the world needs to know about them. Therefore, it was very important to me to talk to family members, to travel to Israel, to listen to their horrible experiences and to disseminate them to the world. And this is why yesterday, when I was in Jordan, I held a press conference there and I reported about the press conference that took place here. I sat beside a father next to a spouse who just normally said goodbye to his wife and his daughters into the weekend, who traveled to their grandparents, and then he got a call from a shelter full of panic in the voices of their loved ones. And ever since, he hadn't heard anything about them, but he had to watch a video where he saw his two young children who were not yet even in primary school. They were pulled onto a truck, and he doesn't know where they are now. These and very similar horrible deeds show the inhumanity of the Hamas terrorists. All that shows why this terrorism needs to be fought, because without fighting Hamas, there is no peace, there is no security. Not in Israel, but also not in the region. Being a close friend of Israel, it's also our task to use our influence so that this country, in the light of terror and mourning, doesn't lose itself, because that's exactly what the terrorists want to achieve. And this playbook of terrorism needs to be counteracted. And therefore, it's very important to think beyond today, particularly when your heart is burning. The terrorists want the dehumanization of the conflict. They want to produce new pictures of atrocities. They don't care about people, also not about the people living in Gaza. And this is what democratic states like Israel distinguishes from the terrorists of Hamas. Israel care about people in Israel and in Gaza, Palestinians, and this is what I heard in Israel. We're not going to give up our humanity, is what I heard time and time again, and this is what distinguishes democratic states from terrorists like Hamas. And during my talks over the last week, yesterday I was in Jordan, before that I was in Egypt, and I held many telephone calls, talked here in Israel and also in Germany. I underlined time and again even though it might seem to be squaring the circle, something which seems to be impossible. Everybody who believes in humanity have two ideas in their minds at the same time, two ideas which cannot be separated from each other. On the one hand, we have the underlying evil, terror. Terror of Hamas needs to be fought against, otherwise there will be no peace, there will be no security, neither for Israel nor for Palestinians. But then again, on the other hand, to cause major suffering amongst the civilian population in Gaza is not only to create fertile ground for new terrorism, but it will also do away and jeopardize the steps of approachment with Arab neighbors, because there is the risk of a regional conflagration, and this is the calculus of the terrorists, and this terrorist calculus must not prevail. The suffering of a Palestinian mother in Gaza who doesn't know where she can get drinking water for her thirsty children will not bring back any of the abducted children back to their Israeli parents, and it also would make one or any of the atrocities carried out by Hamas would nullify them. We all have seen the horrible pictures of the dead people at the hospital in Gaza. Hospitals need to be protected by all warring parties. They must not be attacked by anybody. Blaming various actors on the basis of social media posts are put together very quickly and are being disseminated very quickly. They are used as a tool of propaganda, and the evidence provided by Israel cause very strong doubt in the theory promulgated by Hamas. And this is why yesterday, when I was in Jordan, I warned against this reaction to blame one side without clear evidence. For the international community, it's very important to carry out a profound and thorough investigation. I talked to my interlocutors on site today, and I talked about the humanitarian supply in Gaza. I talked about protected areas in Gaza, like civilian infrastructure, hospitals and schools. The situation in Gaza is disastrous. Everything is missing and lacking. The responsibility for that has to be borne by Hamas with their atrocities last weekend. We have increased our aid from Germany by 50 million euros, and we can start providing aid and supplying aid immediately. At the cross-border point of Rafah, there are many aid supplies piling up there. And I talked to my counterparts to do everything possible in order to open the border crossing for the flow of humanitarian aid. What's particularly urgently needed is drinking water so that cholera and other diseases cannot spread over the next couple of days. The concern around the 100 hostages, families, children abducted by Hamas is something that we cannot let go of. We're concerned about abducted hostages, German nationals, women and children amongst them. The pain and suffering of the family members is without limits. It's also our own pain, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk very closely to the Israeli government, our partners in the region, and we also work together with various actors and talk to various actors in the neighboring countries and United Nations and international organizations. These innocent hostages need to be released immediately. These are innocent parents, children, grandparents. We all want to prevent that the entire region plummets into chaos, and this is why yesterday I traveled to Jordan, and this is why I'm going to continue traveling to Lebanon. And this is why I'm very clear in my messages in these locations. Hezbollah must not pull Lebanon into this conflict. Like so many others, I'd like to emphasize here, I warn Iran, I warn Shiite militias in Iran and in Yemen to join the bandwagon of terror and to put fuel to the fire in spite of the unspeakable terror and suffering, in spite of this unspeakable tension, concern and nervousness that you notice across the entire region. What I'm also perceiving is a small spark of hope, although a very small one. Young people, old people, almost everybody, adolescents and children that I talked to in the region, that I met in the region over these days, they all have the same wish. It's the wish to live in peace and security and safety. The wish of children and young people to go to school, simply free of terror, free of humanitarian suffering. It's the wish for humanity. You're going to travel to Cairo to a peace summit. What are your expectations regarding the peace summit in Cairo? I talked about this small, very small spark of hope. This meeting takes place in a situation where we not only have a very high level of tension amongst all parties in the region, but also where we, international partners, come together in order to make our best contribution in order to prevent a regional conflagration. And to this end, a meeting of various partners can contribute. All those countries and representatives of governments who meet there over the last days have talked to each other bilaterally, non-stop. They had gathered on various locations, and we now meet in a larger round in order to ask the question how to prevent conflagration, how to prevent a civilian disaster and catastrophe. This is what we are going to talk about together, although it's very clear that we have different angles on the situation in the course of these days. At the same time, it's an opportunity to make it very clear that terrorism is to the benefit of nobody in this region. We all need to have this shared interest to prevent the conflict from spreading in the region. And I travel as a representative of the German government because particularly Egypt plays an important role when it comes to preventing a conflagration in the region. It's a very important partner also with a view to providing aid to the region. You mentioned Iran. How is the fundamental willingness of engaging in talk? Are they ready to communicate at all? It's totally clear that this terror, without a contribution and support of Iran, wouldn't have been possible to be carried out. At the same time, during these days, we have various channels of talk to Iran in order to bring it across that no further fuel must be put to the fire. We need to do everything in order to keep the spreading at bay, and this is why we're using our channels, talk to all actors in order to prevent such conflagration from happening.
And that was German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock wrapping up a news conference in Tel Aviv in her second trip to the... And that was German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock wrapping up wrapping up a news conference on her second trip to the region within 2 weeks. With me in the studio is our chief political analyst, Melinda Crane. She was following the foreign minister's speech along with me. Melinda, let's talk about what she had to say. It was a powerful address. I thought she made an interesting division between the inhumanity of Hamas and the humanity of Israel. And she was stressing the need for Israel not to lose that humanity in its response.
Indeed. And In that way, she's gone a bit further than in some of her past speeches. She reiterated once again the fact that Israel has not only a right, but also a duty to protect its citizens, and that Israel must fight Hamas. So that is a message that we certainly have heard from her before, this very passionate solidarity with Israel. But then she said it is also important that in the heat of the moment, that Israel does not lose itself, does not lose its own humanity. And I thought when I heard her words once again of Joe Biden warning Israel, saying, you know, after 9/11, we, in the force of the rage and the heat of that moment, and she also used the term heat of the moment, we made some bad decisions. Now, she didn't go that far, but she did imply that Israel risks giving Hamas exactly what they want if there are many, many images appearing of civilian suffering in Gaza, that exactly could be one of Hamas's aims, because that can drive a wedge between Israel and the Arab neighbors with which it has been trying to cultivate better relations. And there, too, she suggested indirectly, don't give Hamas that. Don't let them essentially stall this rapprochement, this increasing proximity between you and your neighbors by in the heat of the moment, creating those kind of images. And then she went on to issue a very clear warning, once again, to Iran, saying, and in answer to a question, we do have channels of communication that we are using. And you'll remember that the Emir of Qatar was just here in Berlin and spoke with Chancellor Scholz. That visit had been planned before, but Scholz said he had some very clear words to Qatar, which, of course, is also in close contact with Iran. So there is a very strong message there to Iran, essentially to Hezbollah. And she said, once again, she is planning to go to Lebanon, although her own ministry has told Germans that it's time to think about leaving Lebanon. But she is planning to go to Lebanon to convey that message in person, clearly. Stay out. Don't get into this conflict.
On the topic of Iran, she also said that the Hamas terrorist attack against Israel on October 7th that killed so many people and where so many were abducted, this would not have been possible without Iran's support. She said that very clearly. We're hearing her also echo words that we've heard from Chancellor Scholz before. Chancellor Scholz had tried to impress upon Israel the need not to act in rage, right? To not be blinded by rage, I think was the phrase that Chancellor Scholz used in addressing that. We also heard that same warning from Chancellor Scholz when he was visiting the region, also in Tel Aviv, just a couple of days ago, warning Iran, warning Hezbollah directly not to get involved in this. Another point that she was trying to make during her news conference just there now was regarding the plight of the refugees, of drawing, not the refugees, but the hostages, rather, the plight of the hostages that have been taken, more than 200 hostages, elderly, women and children among them, some children not even in primary school yet. There's great concern surrounding that. She was obviously moved by the stories of the relatives that she had met.
Indeed, she has been telling those stories at pretty much every stop on these diplomatic trips that she's been taking, trying, I think, to awaken the empathy and humanity of her interlocutors by individualizing the suffering. And so she once again mentioned meeting a father, a husband of families that had been taken hostage, the father having seen his two small girls loaded onto a truck. And she has told similar stories in Israel about her encounters with Palestinians in Jordan just before traveling on to Israel. She met with a Palestinian, with Palestinian young people and has talked about that. So indeed, trying in a way to put faces onto the suffering. But she has made it very, very clear, as you say, that Israel nonetheless does have a right to take action. And this is a challenge for German leaders to try to convey what she said very eloquently, that we must all hold two ideas in our minds at the same time, that there is this need to protect, this need to fight terror, and at the same time to preserve our own collective humanity. And that it's hard to hold that kind of ambivalence in a time of conflict and fear.
Absolutely. Another important theme in her talk just there was regarding the humanitarian situation, the suffering in Gaza right now that the people there are enduring. She drew attention to some of the deprivations that the people in Gaza are suffering right now, and efforts to try to assure that those people are not going to be left in that situation. She made it very clear that the suffering of the civilians in Gaza is not going to bring any of the hostages home. She tried to make a very, very clear point about that as well. But getting humanitarian aid into Gaza to help the civilians under these conditions is proving extremely difficult. Can Germany or anyone else make that happen?
They're doing what they can, clearly, and it's interesting to note that Germany does have some contacts in the region that, at least for the moment, are not open to the U.S. Joe Biden had planned to meet with the leaders of Jordan and Egypt when he went to Israel this week, and they canceled those meetings after the bombing at the hospital. Precipitously, probably not justified, now that we are pretty sure this was a rocket that was fired by Islamic Jihad, not by Israel, but nonetheless, those meetings were canceled, whereas the chancellor does have an open line of communication with the Egyptian leadership, and she will be traveling on tomorrow to attend this peace summit that has been called by Egypt with other Arab leaders to clearly talk about how they can try to open up these humanitarian corridors that are so badly needed. At the same time, as we know, Egypt is very concerned about opening up a corridor that could be used by Palestinians to leave Gaza and enter Egypt, both because of concerns about massive migration, but also because of concerns about ethnic cleansing that would essentially see Palestinians no longer living in Gaza. So again, an enormous dilemma there for all parties trying to get this crossing open, trying to get these corridors open, with the clock ticking. As she said, there is massive danger to those civilians trapped there in the south of Gaza without water, food, medicine, and power supplies.
Indeed. Melinda, thank you very much. Our chief political analyst, Melinda Crane, with us in the studio. That was Annalena Baerbock.